Talk about the Bracero Program. I actually did a presentation back in 2007. That's now 6 years ago, which is hard to believe. And on the Mexicans during the 1940s, when that was our chap theme that year, so I just can remember that. It was GIs, Pachucos, and Braceros was the program, so I basically cannibalized part of it and added some new stuff to it. Just because there's nobody here except for a few instructors who actually saw that, so we're bringing it back. How many of you knew before going into this what the Bracero Program was? Just want to get a hands up. How many of you have heard of it but you're not sure? You've heard the name but you're not sure what it means. How many of you are like totally clueless? Okay, just want to make sure that we're all in the same boat. And you know, and knowing something or not knowing something is okay because there's been a lot of misinformation about this over the years. And so hopefully we will tell a few stories. And I can't tell you the number of students who come in and instructors who come to me and said, my family came here as Bracero. My grandfather was here. One of my students brought me a copy of the contract that her grandfather signed. Fortunately, I don't have it here right now, but I'll try to have it for the Friday presentation, get it scanned so we can see it. So, without any to do, we'll just go ahead. I do have some songs which I don't know we'll have time for because I know you guys have to get out of here and get to your next class. So I will keep my left eye peeled on the clock there. So. Anyway, today's idea is the Bracero Program, not just the Bracero Program per se, but how it led to changes that many of us would recognize today. So, it's part of our theme this year on workers on the move. So, the Bracero Program was America's guest agricultural work program, but it wasn't just agricultural work. It was established during World War II, and then it was reinvented in the 1950s, and it lasted until 1964, which we'll go over why it disappeared at the very end. There were already Mexican workers here in the valley, but what this did is this opened up opportunities for them to import new workers for a variety of reasons. Now, my Mexican-American history class knows about this because I talk about it all the time, that Americans thought of Mexicans here in the United States as temporary. They didn't really see them as belonging here. So more or less a temporary working class that was not worthy of the attention unless they broke the law. And they didn't belong here. And along with this was the standard racism of the day, which was that Mexican Americans were socially, intellectually, and morally inferior. The same kinds of things they thought about African Americans as well. They also thought that Mexicans were naturally inclined towards criminal behavior. And you see in the little thing in the back, there's a Mexican with a knife waiting to stab one of those American businessmen as he comes around the door here. They're often, as you know, portrayed as bandidos, whether it's the Frito Bandido or some of the others. And the main thing about this was that for the American public, generally it was the idea that Mexicans were not like us. But anyway, the Mexicans were different, that they really didn't fit in. So how could all of this come together as part of the working class? During the Depression, in fact, when times got tough, can we turn that down a little bit? When times got tough, 1.2 million Mexicans were deported. And as you see here, that many people did not want to provide any kind of services. Most welfare services in those days were provided by cities rather than the federal government. And so they very quickly ran out of, during the Depression, of any kind of services that they might have had. So many of these Mexicans that were deported were U.S. citizens, full U.S. citizens under the 14th Amendment, having been born here. But again, because they were Mexican, it didn't make any difference. They simply, the laws were not applied, as they were not applied towards African Americans as well. This shows them being lined up and being sent back on trains to be shipped back. In 1931, I believe, is when this picture was taken. During the war, Franklin Roosevelt met with the Mexican president, Ávila Camacho, in Monterrey in northern Mexico, and trying to line up hemispheric support for the United States in World War II. This is right after Pearl Harbor, and they met in the summer of 1942. Now you have to understand that Mexico had been generally hostile to the United States since the Mexican Revolution in the 19-teens, when the United States intervened twice in their country to try to bring about a result that we wanted that was not necessarily good for them. In the 1930s, Mexico took over American oil companies in Mexico, all their properties and so on. And Mexico was quite proud of that, and the United States saw that as theft. And so we had, up through the time of Roosevelt, we had a rather prickly relationship with our neighbor. But during World War II, this began to change. Mexico began to cooperate with the United States, and here we have the famous squadron of Mexican fighters that actually flew in the Pacific. They provided the only real troops that they provided during the war. But it was a symbolic statement of being in alliance with the United States, as was this poster, as you see here too, which is bilingual, which is actually pretty interesting, since most relations of the United States with Mexico are often done just in English. The Bracero Program was part of this process also, and it was established. They signed the Accord in Monterrey in July 1942, and what was called officially the Mexican Farm Labor Program began in August. Later on, 1951, as I said, it was revitalized as Public Law 78, and the Bracero Program lasts until 1964, when a variety of people work against it, and it's actually a young congressman named George McGovern who actually the fight against it and kills it at that particular time. Over the life of the program, about 4.8 million Mexicans came in and signed individual contracts. Now, some of these may have been repeats, but we have at least the record of that many people coming to work for the United States in a country that was much smaller demographically than it is today. We have well over 300 million, and we have probably just about a little over 100 million at that time. So 4 million people, or almost 5 million people, would be a major impact. Now, the program, all these programs, all government programs are always telling you all kinds of wonderful things. You always have to listen to the promises and then take them with a grain of salt, because in the real world, things don't always happen the way they should. For instance, as you can see here, workers were all promised payment of whatever the prevailing wage was in that area. They had at least guaranteed employment for 3/4 of the contract period, which means you couldn't just say, well, I'm sorry, it's over, so you still had to pay them. They were supposed to have something called, I should have quoted this, adequate sanitary and free housing. They were supposed to have decent meals, whatever that means, and they were supposed to have occupational insurance, which the employers were supposed to give them. Now, the employers were not the federal government. They were individual farmers who contracted with individual workers. They also were guaranteed free transportation back to Mexico. Sounds like a great program, right? You can leave anytime you want. The employers further guarantee that they were not to use them as strike breakers. Well, we'll see about that. And they only are supposed to hire them in areas where there's certified domestic labor shortages. In other words, if there's not enough laborers, that was the only reason why they could hire them. Almost all of these things were ignored. And what happened was they were seen as continuing cheap labor. Up until World War II, the United States had wages for people, then they had Mexican wages. That was substantially less. It was a way so that people had become addicted to hiring Mexicans at lower than prevailing wages. And so with many of the workers going off to fight in the Army, many of the farm workers here in the Valley and so on, Okies who had come here, many of them signed up and fought in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Corps and so on, Marines, that this is the reason why Mexicans were brought in. The growers here in California and Arizona and Texas and others were absolutely afraid that there would be a tremendous labor shortage and they couldn't keep their rates, which they had been doing with extremely low rates for workers. They wouldn't be able to keep exploiting them. And so this is the reason why the Braceros were brought in, to fill this gap of the farm workers going off to war. And so, but the growers simply got they got a labor force that they could do as little as possible for. Many of the places that they lived were a little better than chicken coops that were partially cleaned out, not particularly sanitary. They could not leave their contract area unless they got the employer's permission. So what does that tell you? There's not going to be too many people leaving, even though they get free transportation. Sometimes money was withheld from them. We still have former Braceros and their families today trying to get money that was withheld from them during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s today. And it represents millions of dollars. They were supposed to also take out for Social Security. And where has all this money gone? So many of these issues, even despite we had promises, many of these things were never fulfilled. The term bracero, for those of you who were like me originally, clueless, meant a brazo, or an arm. It meant that they were only valued for the work that they did. They weren't real people. They didn't really count. We weren't supposed to pay any attention to their needs or wants, but instead we were simply to value them for their work. And there's an ID card there. They were recruited in Mexico when the program set up. The Mexican and U.S. government worked hand in hand in this, and they went around to areas, particularly in the north-central part of Mexico, and towards the northeast in the state of Coahuila to south of Texas. This is when Ciudad Juarez and El Paso got a tremendous burst of people moving into that area, primarily because many Mexicans are moving north at this point to become part of this program. Now, why would Mexicans become part of the program? Because problems in Mexico hadn't been resolved. The Mexican Revolution had come and finished in 1921. There had been tremendous numbers of people who had lost their jobs and their lives, and this is when we first noticed lots of Mexicans coming into the United States for the first time. We responded in the 20s with the Border Patrol, which was brand new, and anybody who typically crossed the line, and they used to do this all the time, became automatically an outlaw. They became a criminal. Crossing the border had not been a criminal thing before the 1920s. And so then, but workers continued to come, and before and during and after the Bracero Program, workers continued to come as they still come today. Now, for every immigration, there's a push and there's a pull. The pull is the jobs that were here, or was, and still is, that there's jobs here that needed to be done, and there's people who don't want to do them for whatever reason. The push is, in this case, that Mexico's economy, even despite the revolution and so on, and even taking over the oil fields, and still delivered the promise that they would take care of ordinary Mexicans. And so for ordinary people, particularly farmers and farm workers, there was no alternative. Where do you go? Generally, people in Mexico without a job go to Mexico City. Only some of them come north, but Mexican agricultural workers are not going to find work in Mexico City. So they would come here to El Norte. So they went around, they took pictures of this, and they were eager to work. They wanted to work. They wanted to take care of their families, just like all immigrants usually do. And of course, the United States was happy to say it's part of our war effort. Primarily because, remember, the United States' #1 industry is still agriculture, and we were feeding not just ourselves during the war, but we were feeding all of our allies as well. So we had a strong inclination to support the agricultural programs. Now, a Bracero applicant had to prove that he was a farmer. In this case, the guy is showing that he has calluses on his hand. You couldn't just have some city worker or student show up and say, I'm a farm worker. But you had to have calluses. So I guess if you knew that, you could go out and rub your hands on something for a long time. But that was sort of the scientific proof that they came up out of this. They were all excited. They were going north. It was an opportunity to make money. American wages were, as they are now, were substantially higher than they were in Mexico. And even the Mexican wages that we had paid workers before the Bracero Program were still substantially higher than what was available in Mexico. So it's a win-win, generally. The people are getting a better wage without thinking about the consequences or the conditions, and the growers are getting a lower priced worker that keeps them happy. Here they are lining up in Monterrey, which is the most important city in northern Mexico, and going through the processing that went on there. Here's up to the border, and you can see there's no big fence or anything like that in those days. You could literally walk across. And as the Canadian border was until fairly recently as well. They had a health check because we have to make sure that they're not bringing in diseases. And the assumption, of course, is that people coming from Mexico were full of disease, as well as all of these acceptable behaviors, which we've already noted. But anyway, so they had to, it was rather humiliating because we don't do this to ordinary immigrants and make them go through strip searches, basically. And here they are lined up, basically with all their clothes off, and people peering in their ears and making sure that there's no strange things. A lot of immigrants were actually kept out of the United States for alleged mental disease and so on, and they could do that same thing for Braceros. And then they got sprayed with DDT. They were fumigated to make sure there were no hidden bugs on them. Now, this is a process, by the way, that lasted until the 1960s. If you wanted to fly to Australia or New Zealand, they sprayed you with DDT on the plane. And, but in this case, here they are, all of these poor guys, before they even got here, they're being exposed to dangerous chemicals. So once they did that, they got them on to Los Angeles, and those that were coming to California, and again, they're excited, they're being moved, the special trains are set up, they're looking for the future, the V for victory, which was common during World War II. And could be somebody's grandfather there. And then once they got here they're in an assembly hall, and the idea was that much like much of our agricultural labor, they were organized by contractors who would then go out and try to get a group of people like a work gang and then try to contract with an individual farmer. The farmers could pick and choose people that they wanted. And they had to establish their identity. They had to have all kinds of identification cards and so on. And here is a sample. It's not a very good one, unfortunately. The picture, I know, does not project very well. But this is a Bracero work card. And some families, some of my students have brought in these that belong to their grandparents or great-grandparents. So we've seen some of these are still kicking around. The farmer picks them, lines them up, and then gets them to come over and sign the contracts. Now, being the United States, of course, the contracts were all in English. There was nobody there to translate for them because, after all, speaking Spanish, there's something wrong with you, right? At this particular time period, that there was no multicultural sensitivity to anything like that. So they often didn't know what they were signing. They just knew they were signing, they'd get a job. And then, of course, moving on. This was especially a person looking forward to the future there. Now, a lot of the work this is a notorious working instrument that many of us have never seen before. It's the short-handled hoe. It was preferred by the growers because they wanted people down low working. They wanted to see them working. They couldn't be standing around lollygagging or being lazy. They were bending over working. Now, can you imagine bending over and working all the time? The short-handled hoe was later banned by the state of California as sort of cruel way to work, that it causes all kinds of health problems, literally working on your hands and knees. Hours and hours of what we call stoop labor. And, there's no 8-hour day when you're a bracero. You work basically, not unlike slaves, from sunrise to sunset, and so on. Where they really wanted you working, they'd set up lights or car lights sometimes, and you might work past sunset. But you're bending over the whole time. And this was a typical bracero bunkhouse. They took over whatever territories that they could have, or whatever buildings that were still available. And on the inside, it looks very similar to the kinds of things that Hitler set up for the concentration camps, with the bunks all lined up like that. No bedding or anything. You're supposed to provide all that stuff yourself. The grower, in his kindness, just would simply have that stuff there for you. So, definitely a group experience. Being a bracero meant hard, heavy work. There's no getting around it. Agricultural work, I don't see many of us lining up to go out and do agricultural work unless we have to do it, literally. And it's still perceived as something that many people won't do. But it was, again, working all hours of the day. This is, of course, working the sugar beets, one of the biggest industries here in California. And you would have back problems. You would come out of this with back problems. Working in the fields, filling the crates. They often were paid, some of the prevailing wages, you're paid by the pounds that you carried. How many boxes? If you remember when I talk about the cotton strike in the 1930s, they were getting something like 10 cents per 100 pounds for the amount of work that they were doing. So it hadn't changed much by the 1940s. Agricultural labor was not valued, and so the wages stayed low. Chili peppers here, potatoes, up in Northern California and maybe in other areas. The orchards here in this area, the kind of work, again, that people would have been exposed to the various pesticides that they were using. Then, one of the flip side to all of this is they were doing all of this necessary work throughout the whole period, was that they often, when somebody didn't need them anymore, they would report them to the government and they would deport them and just line them up. So we know, for instance, that 4.8 million got contracts, but 4.9 million were deported over the course of the life of this. And I'm going to play you a brief song right here. This is a famous, what they did is they took a number, I think it was 40 or so braceros, and they put them on this plane. They were flying them down to the border so they could deport them. And the plane exploded over Los Gatos Canyon, which is west of Coalinga. It's not too far from here, about 100 miles or so from here. And everybody died. And in the process of this, Woody Guthrie, who was the sort of the troubadour of the Okies in this area during the Great Depression, was lying in a hospital, and he heard the news report of this, and it talked about, he gave the name of the pilot and the co-pilot and the guard who'd been sent with them, and it said the rest were just deportees. In other words, as Mexicans, as braceros, as deportees, they had no identity and they didn't count. So he responded by writing this song. It's been recorded by most folk musicians in the United States, and it's in English. So if you'll pardon me for a second, I will put it on.
The crops are all in, the peaches are rotting, the oranges are piled in their creosote dump. They're flying you back to the Mexico border to pay all your money to wait back again. My father's own father, he waded that river. They took all the money he made in his life. My brothers and sisters come working the fruit trees, and they rode the trucks till they took down and died. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mi amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane, and all they will call you will be deportees. Now some of us are illegal and others not wanted. Our work contract's out and we have to move on. 600 miles to the Mexico border. They chase us like outlaws, like rustlers and thieves. We died in your hills and we've died on your deserts. We've died in your valleys, we've died on your plains. We've died in your trees and we've died in your bushes. Both sides of the river, we've died just the same. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mi amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane, and all they will call you will be deportees. The sky plane caught fire over Los Gatos Canyon. Like a fireball of lightning, it shook all our hills. And who are these friends, all scattered like dry leaves? The radio says they are just deportees. Is this the best way we can grow our big orchards? Is this the best way we can grow our good fruit? To fall like dry leaves and to rot on your topsoil and be known by no name except deportees. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mi amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane, and all they will call you will be deportees.
That's what Pete Seeger and Arlo Guthrie singing his father's song. If you like country music, almost every country musician has sung a version of this. And just look up Deportee on YouTube, and you'll see Dolly Parton to Johnny Cash and so on. Very popular. In fact, it's sung in many countries as well because of the issues at stake. Here in our valley, braceros were primarily in this area picking cotton, and you would have seen them out there dragging the bags and getting the amounts weighed again. They received a paycheck, and as I told you, that they often would wonder where did the money go, because the money wasn't all there. It was being withheld for the food, it was being withheld for the housing, it was being withheld for Social Security, it was being withheld for all kinds of bogus reasons, actually. So as I said, we continue to have a problem on that. Now, not all braceros worked in agriculture. Thousands of them worked on the railroads, which was also terribly important for the government during wartime. You probably don't know, but that Mexicans have always been involved in building railroads. The railroads that came into Porterville in the 1880s had Chinese and Mexican laborers working together, because again, they were seen as not us, and so that they could quite typically pay them less than they would pay other workers. So we know about the Chinese. You learn about that in 4th grade, but you don't learn that Mexicans were also part of the railroad gangs. And the companies that ran railroads loved having them, and so many of the braceros were directed to go work for the railroad companies as well, to keep the tracks moving, to clean things up, to do all the industrial work, and so Now, of course, the thing continues. Although they were here, there was a lot of prejudice that they had to put up with. As you see, no dogs, no Negroes, and no Mexicans. It's a typical kind of sign. This was an age of segregation, and was, as long as the fiction that separate meant equal, or could be equal, they would go ahead and get away with that. And, but they were quite happy to take the work, but not necessarily did not want Mexicans to stay or be part of the communities. And many businesses had signs like that one on the upper left. As long as you did your work and stayed out in the fields, you were happy, but just stay away. A lot of swimming pools had restrictions against Mexicans. A lot of theaters said that only the balcony seats were for blacks and Mexicans. You were not allowed to sit down in the lower part, and they often didn't serve you any food when you were at the theaters as well. So the assumption again was that you really didn't belong here. During the second part of the program, we had another major series of deportations. During the Cold War period, there was a lot of fear about our borders and are they safe, and are communists trying to sneak in and stuff like that. And so we had Operation Wetback, which President Eisenhower started in '51, but Eisenhower had put one of his generals in charge of it. And it, again, the purpose was to deport people, and well over 1 million people were deported. They were a little bit better than the 30s. They didn't deport American citizens this time. But they used this again to clear out, you know, we have too many people that are working right now or not working, and so we'll just deport them and then start the process all over again. So again, Mexicans were vulnerable to this throughout this period. So again, those nice old cars. The real end of the program came primarily at the instigation of Cesar Chavez. Why would Cesar Chavez be against the Bracero Program? This is your quiz question for the day.
Because it wasn't equal.
Well, you'd think that would be a good answer to that, but it was actually had something more to do with the fact that they were being used as strike breakers. Why should the growers recognize the rights of farm workers if they can bring braceros in to work for less than the local wage? And the growers, they weren't stupid. They had worked, these guys had worked overboard essentially, trying to prevent agricultural workers from having any rights. When the rights were given to all workers in 1935, the Wagner Act, which established the right to establish unions, agricultural workers were exempted because these guys were powerful. When the first strong immigration laws would set up the Border Patrol, Mexicans were exempted because they wanted to keep bringing them in and exploiting them. When you have a good thing going, you work to keep it going and keep making money. And so for a long time, the laws were set up to help large agricultural interests. And in the end, of course, the technology had changed. They were using machines to pick the cotton at the time. So that changed the need for Mexican workers. And so when Congressman McGovern suggested this, working with Cesar Chavez, the program did end. Now, of course, the subtitle for this talk is Catalyst for Change. So what occurred because of the Bracero Program? Because racism didn't go away, we know that. Racism is still around. The Bracero Program ended in 1964, and again, what had happened? What's going to happen next? Well, again, remember, there's a push and a pull. The Mexican government is not producing any more jobs for people. The workers who set up contracts with individual growers and so on, and large farms, they have those contracts still, and the guys are saying, well, I'm sorry the program's over, but why don't you come back? It doesn't matter whether there's a law or not. Come on back, we'll have a job for you. What do you do when you're poor? You go back, because you're getting a better wage than you could get in Mexico. And so what we think of today as this immigration problem was created. I mean, here's the numbers by all of this here. 4.8 million, and I told you 4.9 million deported. But they're encouraged to come back, and there's really no alternative for them, so they come back. Here's how the population changes. The first chart shows the Mexican-born population of the United States, and you see that by 1970 it's starting to rise. That's the one on the left. You can see where it is now, well over 12 million officially. There's a lot more unofficially here, as you well know. And the size on the right is, the one on the right is the Mexican-born population's a share of the U.S. foreign-born. Again, it starts rising dramatically after 1970. Conditions are not improving in Mexico, although health conditions are getting better, and more people are living longer, like we are today. And because of that, it puts a strain on resources, and so more and more Mexicans are producing are going after the jobs. And so they come here, they don't find jobs in agriculture, but they find jobs in other industries. And so they come and stay. It's not because they're outlaws or something like that, because the economy is attracting workers. It's because simply that the economy of the United States was booming at this time, and we were attracting many, many people that wanted to come here. And the obvious, you know, in the last presidential election, they talked about the impact of people who were here as Latino voters, Mexicans, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans, and others are now impacting the United States political process. And here in California, as you know, this is already a minority-majority state. Not that there's anything to be worried about, although some people seem to be frightened at that idea. But it is the reality of who we are and the communities that we represent now. This is a fairly recent article here showing the tsunami, so this would have been from about 2010. It shows the poor Statue of Liberty giving what it says on its pedestal, give me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to be free. And it said, holy beep, because they're supposedly saying we are getting way too many. But this country was built on immigrants and built on people who shared a dream of having a better life. And when we start cutting people off from that, we're cutting our own American dream up. Because almost every group that's come in here has faced discrimination in one shape or another. The last group that gets in always wants to close the door behind it. And it just seems to be unfair, but that's just the way it is. This is something this was from last year, that there is Congress is now talking about creating a new Bracero program. And then yesterday in the New York Times, there was an article about it, in which some of the way to deal with immigration now is to create, if you can prove that you worked here, we'll give you a blue card. And if you worked for the set amount of time for 3 years, then we'll give you a green card and get you on a faster road to getting citizenship. Now, of course, a whole group of people are opposed to that, so don't hold your breath for that happening anytime soon. But what they want is, they want a Bracero program to come in again, so they can come in and work, but don't stay. We don't want you here. You're really not us. These are all the messages that the new Bracero program would simply restate over and over and over again. So have we learned anything? I'm not sure. But we certainly seem to be going in this direction. So that's it. Any questions or comments? Said it would be fast. Yes?
I'm just trying to understand that 4.8 million contracts, 4.9 million deportees. Help me with my math. How did that happen?
They kept coming back.
Okay.
Is there actually 4.8 million different people? Probably not. There's the repeats going on and on. Sometimes they might have come back illegally. Throughout this whole period, although there's a legal system to bring people in, which we see the pictures of the process, people still came anyway. They came any way that they can. And so they were calling them illegals. The term wetback was still commonly used throughout this whole period of people coming in here illegally or undocumented or criminal. They've been criminalized now.
So the deportee number is a broader number that does not just include braceros who signed the contract and then.
Well, but it may have been the same braceros coming back several times, and maybe they just had better numbers for the deportees than they did of the people coming in who were coming here undocumented, but still working as a bracero and still supposedly getting all of the quote benefits of the job, unquote. So I just think the government's better at knowing how many people it kicks out than it knows how many are coming in. So, but were the deportations effective? No. So, I mean, quite literally, people have continued to come in and will continue to come in. So, any other questions?
Mention the impact this has on 14 as far as people being born here in the U.S.
14th Amendment.
14th.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, the 14th Amendment, which was a Civil War amendment, or Reconstruction era amendment, which guaranteed to all the ex-slaves that anybody born here was automatically a citizen. And established that you can't take away rights without due process. It also has been in the immigration question, is anybody who's born here as the children of immigrants are also American citizens. And there's been a movement to take away rights of people who were born here, as well as trying to restrict people who were born somewhere else but were brought in here as children. The whole DREAM Act thing that was recently been talked about is a big part of this. 14th Amendment, for those of you who also don't know, established women's rights. There were no rights for women. The Act says for the first time in any constitutional amendment, all persons born in the U.S. are citizens. And it took a judge to figure out that women are persons too. It took some time for them to figure that out. But you know, if there are people today who want to gut the 14th Amendment because they don't want of Mexican immigrants. And that would mean there would be whole groups of people, not just Mexicans, that they would be taking rights away from. So the Constitution is the Constitution. We need to protect that. So, anyway, sorry I didn't explain that. Way back.
What's the difference between a green card and a blue card?
You know, the blue card is just like a step along the way to a green card. And it was just meant to recognize that there are people that are here that are working. They've been here. They're contributing to society. Because the other assumption that people who are against immigration is the lie that people are just here to get welfare. And so, of course, everybody's going to be upset. They're taking something from us. But the reality is, if you know anything about the fields, the workers are here to work. And you know, there's not like there's a big line of people who aren't working at the, well, we have plenty of people of our own who are at the welfare, you know, offices and so on. The work fair, as it's now called, I guess. Can't be giving anything away. But that's, the blue card is meant to recognize that they are here and that they're doing something that they should be doing. So it's just a proposal. And you'll find it in the New York Times if you want to read up on it. It's yesterday's edition. Yes?
Yeah, I'm looking at the picture up there where they have like a short hole. And supposedly they were short to improve accuracy when they were hoeing, picking the crops.
Yes.
And so supposedly also, I don't know if you're familiar, when they outlawed this, they went to the longer hoe.
The longer hole, yes.
But they used to sharpen the points so people wouldn't lean or rest on the
So we can't rest while you're working.
right, so you couldn't.
I don't let my students rest either.
Yeah. Anyway.
No, you're right. The short hoe was seen as keep them working. They will work hard. They're bent over. We're closer to the ground. They can't hide. And then when it was outlawed, they went, as you said, to a much longer traditional hoe, but sharpened again to keep you from just leaning on it and taking a rest while you're working in the field. So hoeing is not easy work. It's backbreaking work, whether it's a long hoe or a short hoe. So I can see all the little lines going. So, any other questions? There were other hands that were up. I saw them. Yes.
Okay, somewhere in the cobwebs of my mind, there is something that says that the Braceros who returned to Mexico were supposed to have had certain portions of their pay withheld.
Yes.
And
Social Security.
and supposedly the U.S. government transferred these funds to Mexico where it disappeared.
Yes.
Is it that?
Yes, yeah. The Mexican government has disappeared that, but there's efforts. There's a movement in the United States to go after funds that they thought were sort of, despite the assurances of the program that were supposed to provide for the workers. Those were, many times they were charged for that, so they want their money back from that. But also, the funds were withheld. There's the Mexican Social Security, which is a completely optional program in Mexico. And not only middle class and upper people actually get Social Security in Mexico today. The poor have consistently been discriminated against. And so these poor workers are not only being screwed by the American growers, they're being screwed by their own government. But you're absolutely correct. Mexico has failed to follow through on this in a big way. Mexico is not a poor country with all that oil. They're making money hand over fist. So they just don't want to spend it on people. So. Sounds familiar, exactly. No comments? Yes, Maurice.
You might comment on the fact the comparison of the Okie movement, Dust Bowl thing in the 30s to the Bracero program and the attitude of the same people who were treated that way in the 30s versus what's going on in the 40s and today.
Yeah, I know one of my students is actually doing a project on the Okies and the Mexican workers during the Depression. But during the 1930s, when the workers were already here, and there were Mexican workers, and then we had large numbers of people that we call Okies who didn't all come from Oklahoma. They came from Texas and Arkansas and places like that. They came here and they were working, and you'd think that there was some sort of conflict, but there wasn't. Actually, they did a lot of things in common, especially the 1933 cotton strike that I did the talk on last semester. They worked together on that, and they cooperated. The growers here despise the Okies as much as they despise the Mexicans. They just felt that they could control the Mexicans better because you always had the threat of deportation over their head, and they could get more out of them. But Okies were in the end, even though they looked on them as poor white trash, which is a term that I didn't hear until I came to Porterville, they looked down on them. They still considered Mexicans to be lower than Okies, and that again they were the preferred workers that they really wanted. We could break the Okie strike if we just bring in the strike, for instance, south of this area was predominantly an Okie strike in the cotton strike in the 30s, that centered around Bakersfield and Arvin and stuff like that. It was north of the Fresno area, it was mainly Mexican workers at that time. And so Okies, of course, have moved on, and they've saved their money, and they've become a property class and own businesses and property now. And that's what my firm belief, that Mexican workers are in the process of doing the same thing. They're becoming part of the general community. They're following the same track that other workers have done. I don't know if that answered all of your question, but there's a lot of similarities between what happened to real life people.
I just meant the fact that seems like each group, as you said, as they make it, then they want to, as you use the word, turn around and close the door
Yes.
on that next group.
It's unfortunate that people believe we live in a zero-sum world, which means if you get some sort of benefit, it's being taken away from me. And so that's how they often look back at people who are getting we're giving stuff away, we're and so on like that. You hear this, politicians talk about this the whole time, unfortunately, and they exploit it. So, other questions? You've been a very attentive audience. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.